Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rebecca Lee, and I'm the Executive Director of Vivli. Welcome to our webinar today. We'll be talking about working together to enabling data sharing. After our presentation today, we will be sending a link to the recording and slides. And as we go through, we will be asking that you post your questions via the Q&A function, and we will be responding to your questions at the end of the webinar today. You will be muted throughout this presentation. What I'll be doing is just walking you through our agenda. We have 3 parts to our agenda for our webinar today. So for the first segment, I'll be walking you through how to use Vivli to meet your NIH data sharing requirements. So giving an overview about Vivli, who we are and our mission, talking about the steps to completing your NIH data sharing DMSP and the budget justification, and also describing the types of data that might be shared on Vivli. For part 2, we'll have an interesting panel discussion. So that'll be moderated by our Senior Director, Julie Wood. Julie, you want to give her a bit of a wave? And then we have 3 panelists, Anne Seymour from Johns Hopkins, Amy Nurnberger from MIT, and John Borghi from Stanford Medicine. So that'll be a really interesting panel discussion. You'll be hearing from people that are experienced in supporting researchers, so we hope you enjoy that. And then for our third segment, that'll involve all of you, the participants, and we hope that you'll be putting your questions in the Q&A segment as we go through for either myself, questions about Vivli, or questions for our panelists directly. So let's dive right in. I'll be starting off with a bit about Vivli and who we are, and then talking about the DMSP. Vivli is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were launched about 5 years ago, and we offer convening for a number of diverse stakeholders, including the biomedical industry, academic institutions, government funders and regulators, as well as patient and patient advocates. We offer harmonization of language and agreements and try to move the culture of data sharing. We oversee the implementation of the Vivli platform, which is on Microsoft Azure, which is a user-friendly, secure, state-of-the-art data sharing and compute platform. As we all know, the NIH data sharing policy went into effect late last month in January of 2023, and now we are kind of post policy today. So if your grant doesn't designate a specific repository, it's recommended that a generalist repository be used. And we're listing here all of the generalist repositories, of which Vivli is one of them. Vivli is really the only NIH recommended generalist repository that has a specific focus on sharing of human participant level data using a managed access process. And we meet all of the desirable characteristics of a repository for human research, human subjects research. What we're showing here are really the 4 major data sharing milestones as we see them. The first really comes once your grant is submitted, and that is to complete the DMSP. And we're offering some Vivli guidance and resources for that step, and I'll be stepping you through that guidance today. Secondly, once the grant is hopefully awarded, to list Vivli on the ct.gov registration, which is element 12 now on clinicaltrials.gov, as your repository that you'll be sharing on. There are also some requirements that come from journals as well of listing repositories. So ICMJE also requires that if you're publishing in some of those journals to list on element 12 of ct.gov. And we can certainly step you through some of those as well. Another major data sharing milestone we see as when the primary publication is completed, to consider submitting data underlying the publication to the repository and receiving a DOI, digital object identifier, for use in the publication. And then lastly, when the study is completed or the trial is completed, to submit the complete study data set. So these are what we see as the 4 major data sharing milestones. For the submission process itself, we also see 4 major steps. First of all, creating an account on Vivli, providing the information about your study, signing the data contribution agreement, as we call it, the DCA, and then uploading the anonymized data. This DCA or data contribution agreement can be signed in advance between us and your institution. We certainly, our team really wraps around and supports researchers like you through the process, and a DOI can be provided for use in subsequent publications for each data set. A report on proposals for secondary analysis can also be provided upon request. Guidance for researchers submitting grants to NIH who want to use Vivli. We have a number of resources that are shown here, and we're showing these, the NIH DMSP template and budget justification, a guidance, study submission and checklist, and we have a number of other resources that are shown and will be linked in this slide set. What I'll do next is walk you through the various elements of the DMSP and the guidance that we're providing. So starting here with the various data types, so Vivli is really designed for the sharing of individual participant level data and associated files. These data sets really need to be anonymized to be shared on Vivli, and our team offers support throughout this entire process. The type of trial, the data sets that are shared on Vivli includes human data, so that can be trials, observational studies, registries, or real-world data. All of this data really has to be anonymized before uploading to Vivli. We can help connect you with vendors that can do that, or sometimes institutions have in-house capabilities to anonymize data. Studies really need to be prospectively planned and protocol-driven. These are the particular elements that are included in a shared data package. So we have the recommended data set as shown above the line. These include those data or data sets, data package elements that really inform how the data can be used. And these include the study protocol, the data dictionary that are detailed descriptions of every variable in the data set, the statistical analysis plan, and the IPD, or the final raw data set itself. We are also starting to ask for something called the anonymization guidance that outlines the method used to anonymize the data. There are some optional pieces as well, as you can see below, that includes the CRFs, for example, the case report forms. Element 2 really talks about the specialized tools, so sharing the codebook and other explanatory documentation, and also any other detailed specialized programs or software that really need to be used to open the files themselves. Element 3 talks about common data standards and metadata, some Vivli repository considerations. We actually don't mandate any current data standards. So any data that's provided in a format such as R, SAS, data, Excel, or CSV is acceptable. Right now for clinical trials, SDTM or CDISC standards is recommended to support the most efficient data aggregation, reuse, and sharing. It's now the standard for a number of therapeutic areas. And so we offer a link here but that really is useful if you're setting up your trial. But if you're already midway through, that train has already left the station. But we offer this for those of you that are starting the protocol development stage, because there are a number of therapeutic areas that already have a CDISC standard for data collection. The metadata is professionally curated by providing us the ct.gov identifier, and then we go and curate the metadata. This is an example of how the metadata appears on this Vivli platform for something called the Solidarity Trial from WHO. This is the first level of metadata as it appears when you come into Vivli. This is one of the large COVID trials provided by WHO. And then when you click on View Study Details, you can see the next layer of metadata as you would come in, shows the phase, the intervention, brief summary of the data, and other metadata that you can see on the platform. Element 4 really talks about the name of the repository, the metadata, how the scientific data is findable and identifiable via a persistent unique identifier, and when the data is made available. As per the NIH, the data really needs to be archived and available for time periods. So we say NIH requires that data is accessible no later than the time of the associated publication or at the end of the grant period, whichever comes first. We make the data available for a minimum of 10 years after contribution. And then you can see how we've laid out the usage of DOIs, and then ORCID IDs are linkable to data sets using data credit roles as well. Element 5 discusses data access, distribution, and reuse considerations. So we talk about reviewing the informed consent form to ensuring sharing is allowable. Access to the data is controlled by a managed access process and provided only after approval, and protections for privacy, rights, and confidentiality of human research participants. This is something that we really specialize in via our managed access process. And there are really multiple levels of protection for managing human participant data in Vivli. All contributors attest that the data is anonymized, and then they sign a data use agreement with multiple protections in place. The data is securely archived in Microsoft Azure in the cloud. Element 6 really talks about compliance and how that's monitored and managed, and that the PI really ensures that the data is submitted and shared according to this plan. We give suggestions on that oversight in a number of in some of these paragraphs, and you can come and see how we've suggested that. But you really have to come out with your own oversight plan. Overall, really, this is the team overseen by the PI and conducting the oversight at the institution. In terms of the budget justification section, this is in your plan. So allowable costs are, curating the data, developing the documentation, anonymizing the data, and preparing the metadata. And so we have provided a budget justification online. To summarize, for those that are members of Vivli, these costs are waived. So member institutions cover this by a membership cost. Those that are not members of Vivli, we welcome you to share on Vivli, but this is a $4,000 per study cost. So this is for the duration of sharing for 10 years. And this is for all studies under 500 gigabytes. Larger studies are costed a bit higher. Anonymization fees can be performed through your institution. So many institutions have this available, but if outsourced, we would suggest you allot $10,000 per study through our preferred vendors. This is just a table that shows how this is costed if you're by a member institution, can share unlimited trials shared under the umbrella of the institution. You can allot $10,000 per study. Member institutions also have and receive institutional reports summarizing what they receive through Vivli and what studies are shared, as well as other metrics. We also offer customized portals for researchers to access Vivli included in the member institution. Shown here is simply a member report that's provided annually or upon request to help manage this compliance, and with a number of various metrics that really helps at the institutional level. And then we also offer a single point of access to the platform, and it's just really helpful for universities to access the platform. So what I'd like to do is really turn it over to our panel now, and moderated by Julie Wood, our Senior Director. So Julie, take it away.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rebecca. So I'll have our panel come on. It's wonderful to have them all here so that we can just really kind of have a discussion. And I've got some questions for the panelists to answer, but maybe if we just start off as we kind of get going with having John, Amy, and Anne really talk about how their institutions have prepared for these changes with the NIH policy change, and what kind of questions researchers are asking them. So if you could each we'll start there and have you each give us 2 minutes on what you're doing. So John, if we could start with you, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for that. So my institution, I think, is grappling with the new requirements and supporting researchers primarily through trying to bring all the kind of diffuse resources that are present at Stanford that support researchers and their data together to provide a more coordinated type of service. So something that we did immediately before the January 25th sort of deadline is we started very heavily advertising what we call the Stanford DMP service, which is a collaboration of the library and a bunch of other stakeholders to provide kind of a single point of entry for researchers who have questions about data management and data sharing and data management and sharing plans, but don't quite know which of the many resources to seek out and how to find them and all that kind of stuff. And so we are, like many other universities, now tackling a lot of DMSP related consultations and doing a lot of referrals to research computing and the privacy office and a number of other offices who can answer the questions that we get. And I should also say that, prior to February 1st, I was a data librarian, and my new role, which is in the Office of the Senior Associate Dean of Research, is kind of reflective of this approach of taking a more coordinated approach to providing service and helping researchers at the point that they need it, and hopefully before they even know that they need it. So lots of education, lots of outreach, but mostly lots of coordination.
Yes, I think that's something that's come across, is that level of coordination that is needed. So John, it's great to hear that you're in that new role and kind of pulling that together. Amy, would you like to kind of comment on what you're seeing at MIT and kind of how that coordination and how that preparation has occurred?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you for giving such a great place to build on there, John. It is truly all about the coordination when it comes down to this. We had started with that work a good year before the effective date of the NIH policy. We knew it was coming, and that took a lot of conversations with each of the major players or stakeholders across the Institute who have a piece of that kind of data pie, if you will, and really trying to get to know each other, how to pass concerns between the groups so that our community doesn't need to be hunting for the right person, but rather be able to create a system of concierging those questions so that we can get the right question to the right person to answer it. So that's one of those spaces of coordination. As the implementation date got nearer, we also worked much more closely with our Office of Research in terms of communications as well, and developing those resources, not only for our researchers and those who are actively writing those data management and sharing plans, but also for those other people in administration who work with the researchers to get those plans through, understand what those questions are, develop a larger understanding of how NIH's data management and sharing policy fits in with all of the other agencies' data management and sharing policies that have been out there for the last good 9 years or so. So really, letting our NIH researchers know that there were places, there were areas of expertise that they could also go to. I think I should point out that I think I'm the odd one out on this panel, since I'm the only, we do not have a medical school, while both John and Anne are coming directly from their medical schools and their medical libraries. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Amy. And I think there is a lot to learn, and that's a great point, that there are those resources available outside of the medical libraries and with the NIH policies, because data sharing has been happening in other places for quite a long time. So that's a great point. And then I'll turn to Anne. What are you seeing, and how did Johns Hopkins kind of start to prepare and think about this in terms of looking at other places within Johns Hopkins to share or wider? So over to you, Anne.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. And just like my colleagues, a huge amount of coordination is taking place over this. And just to echo what Amy said about supporting data sharing for many years, and in particular, a group at Hopkins is the JHU Data Services, which is based in our university library. And but about 2 years before the effective date of the policy, a working group was formed from the libraries. So our JHU Data Services, the Welsh Medical Library, and representatives from across the institution who had an interest and wanted to contribute to this working group. And so this group has been working on gathering information and getting ready to share resources with our community. And then as we got closer to the effective date, there's just been a lot of collaboration from the entities that have already been mentioned: our School of Medicine, Office of Research Administration, the Office of the Vice Dean for Research, our university's Research Administration Office, our School of Medicine or Hopkins Medicine Data Trust, which is the group that governs the use and disclosure of clinical enterprise data, and even our Office of General Counsel. I mean, they've all been involved and with developing resources and guides and training, and everybody is kind of receiving questions, and we're trying to consolidate sort of an entry point through our university's Research Administration Office, but many of the questions are directed to our JHU Data Services group and supported by the Welsh Library as well. And they're really doing the lion's share of specifically answering questions and consulting on the plans and encouraging the use of the DMP tool, which is managed out of our JHU Data Services group. So very similar to my colleagues.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme there of consolidating and questions in terms of making sure things get to the right place. And I'm curious, kind of, John, in your new role that you were talking about, what kind of questions are you starting to see about the policy and kind of filling out the DMSP? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, in large part, they're the same kind of questions I was getting from my previous role. And those, well, I guess the source of those questions is much broader now. So prior, it was mostly from researchers, but now it's from every kind of unit that touches a DMSP in any capacity. So the grants office, the research development offices that are scattered throughout the university. And I think the primary questions I've been getting, aside from, what resources do we have to answer these questions, are actually what are these questions even asking? So the one that comes to mind immediately, because I was answering it right before this call, was a researcher who emailed me to ask, I don't understand, what is a data standard? What is this question even asking me? And so walking them through the process of, defining their data the way that NIH is asking for, talking about the software and code, but then walking, very senior researchers through what a data standard actually is and what the question actually is asking them for. So I think that's actually the number one question I have is, what does this question even mean? Which, to me just speaks to the amount of education I still need to do, I think, across the school in terms of educating folks on all this. But yeah, mostly that's the questions I've been getting.
Excellent. Yeah, that I'm sure that is probably a similar refrain that others would talk about, the data standards and how that moves forward. Amy, were there other surprises kind of that you have seen that have come through as this has started to, as you kind of started the preparing for this policy change?
I think I'm going to go ahead and let Anne take that question.
Sure. Anne, you want to take that question? Over to you, Anne.
Sure. I mean, we've been getting, like John said, what is this? Do I really need to do this? That's like the early question. Questions about budget. Much of the kind of digging deep and consulting by our JHU data services is matching people with the right repository. That can sometimes take a lot of work. And where and how to share restricted access data. We're pointing to Vivli, of course. And there's a lot of misunderstanding or not full understanding of de-identification and what that means. So a lot of questions around that.
Absolutely. And yeah, I can see that we have a question in the chat, in the Q&A that's come through on that, and we will take questions at the end. So please do keep those questions coming, and we will follow up with those questions. In terms of, now let's turn to you, Amy, in terms of kind of what advice you're providing around these issues for researchers and those in similar academic positions who maybe haven't had as much time to prepare for the policy, and how to approach these issues as they're starting to get those NIH grants in and needing to fill out the DMSP.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think at the core of it, there are two branches that we like to address. The first is that there are actually a lot of people at the Institute who are here to help you, who have experience, who have resources in this. There are a lot, it may seem confusing and overwhelming at first. We acknowledge that, and we're working on making it easier for you, but there are a lot of stakeholders in this space. So the confusion is going to happen. The second really major piece of advice to researchers in this space is that writing and submitting your data management and sharing plan is just the first step. That's your starting point. That's not that's you're going to go on from there, so that when you are writing that data management sharing plan, we try to provide a lot of guidance about how to be thoughtful about what you're writing, about what you are budgeting for, with the acknowledgement that the point of this plan is not just to tick that checkbox, I got a plan done. Excellent. I submitted it, but to make sure that you are writing a plan that you can actually execute and fulfill. Because as you go through the execution of your research, that plan is going to help you make good choices, hopefully, about how you're going to collect your data, how you're going to document your data, how you're handling your data, so that you can manage it and share it effectively. So we're really encouraging people to look carefully at what they're stating in those data management and sharing plans. The NIH has some great resources. The Network of National Library of Medicine has some even better resources, and I would really encourage people to go check out their toolkit for the NIH data management and sharing policy, to check out what the materials that the working group on NIH DMSP has put out there in terms of resources for some of what John mentioned in terms of like, what does this question even mean? But also to treat those resources in the context of your own operating space, within the context of your own institution. Some of the NIH exemplar plans that they put out a little early on certainly did mention things that I think aren't available to a lot of institutions. And the one that really sticks out in my head is there was an implication that there was perhaps some office at your institute that would have oversight and compliance control over your data management and sharing plan. I have yet to speak to someone at an institution that has one of those offices, and there are good reasons for that, right? Data management and sharing is a much more complicated area than sharing your article or doing some of those things. So it's unlikely to have that singular overarching office that can take on that entire task. So I mean, if you're at an institution and you don't have this thing, it's okay. It's a complex area, but if you are at an institution and you have one, I would love to speak with you. But I think really, like I said, those are the two major places. There are people out there to help you. Be thoughtful about writing your data management and sharing plan. If you're someone more on the administration, helping researchers side kind of thing, trying to think about how am I going to coordinate all of this stuff? Who am I supposed to talk to at my institute? I would really recommend to you the AAU APLU report on accelerating public access to research data. It's a great place to start with thinking about what this might look like, what these conversations might look like at your institute, as well as you're continuing to build resources for your own research community.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that, Amy. I do think that is a really excellent point in terms of this is not a tick box exercise. This is the start. Make sure you can fill it out and follow it. And just really wanted to kind of come back to the point too of data standards. You know, how are you all handling if someone says, I don't know what a data standard is, or there isn't a data standard? So places where there's gaps, you know, John, you were talking a little bit about how more and more, you know, you're trying to explain a data standard, or sometimes there's not. Because I can see that researchers want to put in a standard, but it's not always there. So I guess I would just ask if you all are, how do you tell people it's okay to say, well, there's not a standard, you know, things are not there, this is not worked out, or just, and really just want to open it up if you all have any comments about either of those points or any questions you'd like to ask each other as well. So I'll turn it over to the panel to kind of ask questions or comment on that.
Well, I'll start by saying that we have some folks in our bioinformatics unit here at Stanford that are very invested in the development of standards. So every time we get something like that, I file that information away to pass along to them so they can pass along to people who are funding their research to make this ecosystem of standards more robust, right? So that's one kind of long-term strategy. But in the more immediate term, I think partially the response is to reassure folks that it's okay if they are not aware of standards and that there just aren't standards for particular types of research. And, you know, something that I'm often reminding researchers as they're doing their DMSPs is, you know, it's not a mandate for, you don't have to have a standard in here if you can justify why there isn't one. And one really good justification is one does not exist. And at that point, you know, I do remind them that it's probably useful, though, if you say that, to address kind of what the question of standards is actually asking about, which is usability and interoperability. So to mention how you're keeping things, if not to a widely adopted global formal standard, at least standardized within your research group, and address how your data will be usable by others. So well documented, well organized, uploaded into repositories that have, you know, good metadata, those kinds of things. So it, you know, we help them try to find standards if they exist. And if they don't exist, we encourage them to take a step back and address kind of the heart of what the question is actually asking, which is, how is this data actually going to be usable?
Great.
I think getting at the heart of the policy is the fact that there isn't a data standard in some cases. NIH needs to know that. I mean,
Right.
and that's sort of the whole point in doing this, is to gather information and make access to and use of data easier.
I don't know how many plans from other universities are going to say this, but there's lots of plans that come from my university that say there is no widely accepted data standard for X type of data.
Many of mine are also saying
Yeah.
something very similar to that, right? You know, you in a consultation, you make your best effort and you're like, okay, let's go look for what the potential data standards out there might be. Most times you're right, there isn't one. You need to address the heart of the problem. I'm always trying to help people like think about, so there isn't a data standard. Wouldn't it be great if there were one? Who do you think you could talk to in your discipline about that type of thing for that longer range plan? But also, you know, acknowledging, as John and Anne had mentioned, that the heart of this question is asking about reusability, interoperability. So what are you doing in your own lab? What are the other forms of documentation you're creating around this as well, with those ideas, even though because to some extent data standards implicitly hold a certain value of documentation for that data as well. And so making up for that in some other way, if you are doing something local in terms of data standardization, how are you going to be documenting that? How are you going to be explaining that to future users, to future viewers of your data as well?
Great, thank you. Now let's turn to other questions. Panelists, what questions do you have for each other? Anne, I think you got some.
Well, I just wanted to make one other point about advice to researchers, and this I heard loudly from my colleagues at JHU, is do not copy and paste the example language. And that kind of applies to the data standard. And it kind of gets at a bigger issue of, you really need to encourage researchers to understand this policy, because it can benefit them throughout the life of their proposal, from as they're thinking about the question and the data they're going to be collecting. You know, having a plan in mind is going to make it a better proposal overall. And you know, that's kind of a hard a hard point to make with a senior researcher. And so one of the thoughts from my colleagues at Hopkins is identify somebody on your team that can become the expert in this, and have them be the ones that are diving deep into the policy and looking for repositories and looking for standards in their discipline.
Excellent. Thanks, Anne. Appreciate that. And I think, did you have other questions for the panelists, for the other panelists as well?
Sure. And I don't know how many questions we have in the Q&A, but one thing we wanted to hear from, I wanted to hear from my colleagues is, what are you hearing reluctance to share data from your researchers, and why, and what do you tell them?
So it's actually been surprising to me that how low that number has been of researchers who are reluctant, but it has happened, certainly. And sometimes it's because of very justifiable reasons. They have data that actually can't be shared in any form. They've signed a data use agreement, or it is incredibly sensitive in ways that it cannot be de-identified or anonymized and still be usable, frankly. So that, which is a conversation about how they just need to describe that in the DMSP, and that's what it is. But we've also had some researchers who are just kind of unwilling for the usual reasons, worried about being scooped, you know, whatever other kind of reasons. And often that conversation, or other justifiable reasons, like the data is 5 terabytes and there's not a good place to store it, right? Something like that. And so the conversation that I have with them then becomes like, okay, well, you don't want to share your raw data. We can talk about that. I don't want to table that entirely, but let's talk about what the policy is actually asking for. And that's actually asking for the stuff that underlies your results. And so let's talk about what that is and what forms you are more or less comfortable making available to others and what mechanisms there are about how to do that. And I think once we get into a more nuanced conversation, it actually becomes much easier to convince them to like share the data we wanted them to share in the beginning. Because they feel heard and their concerns addressed and understood. And I think it goes a long way often to just say, like, this is not an open data policy. You are not being mandated to share every piece of information that comes out of your instruments. They're specifically looking for specific things. And I think once that conversation becomes more nuanced, it often becomes like, oh, okay, so I can just make this available through whatever repository, Vivli, another generalist repository, or a repository I'm already sharing through. And it's actually much less onerous and burdensome than I thought. So yeah, I think we have definitely received some people who are unwilling to share. One of them actually shares an office with me, which is a fun thing. But for the most part, it's been relatively straightforward to have a conversation with them and address their concerns about it.
Yeah, I would say similarly, we've had a few of those conversations about do they have any idea what they're asking us to do? Yes, they do. But I've been very heartened that so we've ended up presenting at quite a few departmental meetings about the policy. And it's been really great to see how other researchers in the department will take up that question and respond to the reluctant sharer in the group, shall we say, and really be able to bring out the points about to what you said, John, what the policy is really asking for, which goes, as we know, to the bedrock of what we understand as scientific research about being able to share your results, that it's not asking you to betray confidences, it's not asking you to do the impossible. What it is asking you to do is to thoughtfully prepare beforehand with the expectation that these materials can and should be shared to the greatest extent while protecting privacy, right? Keeping the restricted stuff restricted, whether that means doing anonymization or depositing it with repositories like Vivli that can handle restricted materials, things like that. But really to that point of being able to have those conversations in those nuanced ways with other researchers at the table as well about what it's meant for them, for their pursuit of research, how it's benefited them, what they've actually done in their own labs to put workflows and processes in place that allow them to productively and effectively fulfill data management and sharing expectations.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think we're going to turn now to, we have a poll where, Rebecca, if you could reshare your screen, where we just want to get some feedback from the audience in terms of where those who are participating in this webinar, about where they're at as they're thinking about their DMSPs. And you can see the link that is in the chat. If you can go into that link, we can see where you're at. So Rebecca, do you want to ask the question? Yeah.
So the question is, if you're planning on sharing in a repository or supporting researchers, or if you're in a support role to support researchers to share, what is the current stage of your work? And I invite our panelists to also participate here. So the couple stages could be most of, you're looking at searching for the right repository. If you're supporting researchers, maybe most of the researchers are searching for the right repository. The second choice is drafting the DSMP. Third is the trial's ongoing, or you're in the data prep stage. The fourth could be primary publication is completed or close to completion and you're looking for a DOI. The fifth is ready to share data now, or you're anticipating you need to share the data in the next 3 months. So let's see what most people are doing. And we'll wait just a few more seconds and see if we have any results we can discuss. And I'd like our panelists to see if that's what they're also seeing at their institutions. Okay, so right now we have a lot in the drafting of the DMSP. So it's about 3/4 in the drafting of the DMSP and about 1/4 searching. Really interesting, and see if that changes over time. Okay, so it's a pretty resounding drafting of the DMSP. Let's see if that switches. We have no one in the 3, 4, and 5. No one ready to share data now. That's for sure. Our trial ongoing data preparation. Okay, really interesting. So about a 70-30 split here, and I don't see things changing. So any last words of, we can certainly go around and ask if you had any things that you're currently working on as best practices, and I'll just thought we could go around, John, Amy, and Anne, on the primary things right now that you're working on to prepare your researchers that you didn't maybe think about that you would be working on when you started this a year or two ago. I'd love to hear about what you didn't think you'd be doing, but you are doing right now before we close this out.
So what I am doing, including later today, is a lot of education on trying to get folks to think very prospectively about all of these issues. So, the take-home message from a lot of the workshops that I do is your DMSP is just the beginning. This is what you are telling NIH you're doing, and you need to do all of this stuff. But actually implementing this day-to-day is substantially more involved than what you can describe in a 2 or 3 page document submitted as part of your grant application, right? As far as what I did not expect to be doing, I don't know that I expected to be wading so deeply into the deep well that is data use agreements and how to get them and how to deal with them. Not to speak too frankly about it, but we have some difficulties locally about efficient processes for generating DUAs and for dealing with DUAs, and something that our research community has identified as a substantial pain point is this kind of side of data sharing is managing data use agreements.
Mm-hmm.
So repositories and that whole ecosystem is difficult. DUAs is something I did not expect, and it's turning out to be as much or even more difficult.
That is a pain point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anne?
I would say I can't really, this isn't an answer to that question, but one thing that I'm excited to be hearing at my institution is building capacity, both in terms of the human resources and infrastructure, which can include human resources. And I think that there's recognition that we need capacity in our institutions, and even places, that are pretty rich institutions with a lot of resources, we still need better capacity for dealing with this.
Thank you. I'm sure those of you at institutions probably agree to that. And Amy?
Yeah, I'd have to go along with what Anne said. It's been great to hear some of those conversations really take off in the past year or two, with acknowledgement that this policy is coming into effect, and thinking about what that means is in an institutional space and what it means to truly provide a good, sustainable support for our research community in this space of research data management and sharing, and having that be more strongly recognized as something that the Institute needs to invest in going forward.
Thanks so much. Julie, any last words?
Just wanted to thank the panelists. I think there's been a lot of really good questions being answered. There is a wealth of information that came out and links in the chat. We'll also send the recording and the slides, but also would encourage you, reach out to the Vivli team. We're here to help if you're getting stuck with any aspect of this and how to use Vivli, can you use Vivli, what we can help with. So thank you to everyone for all of your great comments and questions today.